The pandemic hits, we're all quarantined for a bit, and I did what I knew best, which was inform my friends and family about what was going on. My several hundred friends and family turned into several thousand, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. And I'm like, oh, wow, people are leaving these traditional platforms. They have lost trust.
Welcome to After the Fact for the Pew Charitable Trusts. I'm Dan LeDuc. You just heard from Moshe Wanunu. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of Mo News, which is devoted to curating verified and balanced news. We'll hear more from him in a bit. Today, we're exploring changes in how people are consuming news. Who are they listening to? How are they tuning in? And what information are they getting? It's no secret there have been major changes to the news landscape in recent decades. According to Pew Research Center, 39% of U.S. adults under the age of 30 regularly get their news from news influencers. With information available from so many different sources, how can Americans know who to trust?
It's hard to be a news consumer these days.
Mike Lipka is a former journalist and the Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center. His focus, Americans' experiences with news and information.
You have the economic struggles of many news outlets. You're not getting the reporting that you used to get from a local newspaper or a local radio station or something. But then you also have trust in news media, and there's a huge partisan gap there, which we've seen for a while.
These findings are part of the Center's longtime research on journalism and its new partnership with the Knight Foundation. The Pew Knight Initiative supports research on how Americans absorb civic information, form beliefs and identities, and engage in their communities. He told us about the data behind these changes in trust and the role of journalists today. Dramatic change in the news media in the last 3 or 4 decades. I mean, I started out as a reporter like you did, and, I feel like a dinosaur compared to how things work now. I worked for a newspaper where it came out once a day,
Yep.
And now it's minute by minute. If you could, put some data behind some of those changes.
Lots of different organizations are finding that trust in journalists and in news organizations more broadly has decreased pretty dramatically in national news organizations. That's the one where we've seen sort of the steepest decline. In our latest survey, 81% of Democrats say that they have a lot of trust or some trust in the news that comes from national news organizations. And that number is only 53% for Republicans. So you have this almost a 30-point gap there between the two parties when it comes to trust in national news organizations. For Democrats, it's been fairly steady. For Republicans, that's what's really driving the drop. There's been a gap for a long time, but it used to be a fairly small gap. As the years went on, that was no longer true. But there still exists this huge gap in trust in national news organizations. Now, with local news organizations, not as much of a partisan gap. There is a bit of a gap there, but Republicans are much more trusting of what they're getting from their local news organizations.
Do you have any data that gets at the why behind trust?
Yeah, absolutely. Huge percentages of Americans say that news organizations are influenced by not only politics and governmental interests, but also corporate and financial interests. So there's this huge question in a lot of people's minds of where's the money coming from? What's their agenda? So that's one thing that people express on both sides of the aisle. And we have findings that show a majority of Americans, and particularly an even larger share of Republicans, who say that journalists aren't able to separate their personal views from their reporting, right? They just don't think it's possible. There's this sort of traditional journalistic notion of objectivity that journalists have sort of strived for a long time.
Sure.
So they've taught in journalism school. And I think there's just skepticism about whether that's actually possible these days.
The Pew Research Center has some new data about journalists and their role in society. Tell us more about how people view the reporters and commentators that come to them.
We just did this study, super excited about it. Some of the key findings. People value journalists. The vast majority of Americans still say that journalists are at least somewhat important to the well-being of society. So I think that sort of reflects.
And is that across the spectrum?
There are differences.
Okay.
There are differences, but still, there is
Overall.
a recognition, even among Republicans, most Republicans still saying at least somewhat important to the well-being of society. They're not saying it as strongly. Democrats are much more likely to say they're very or extremely important to the well-being of society. But even Republicans are saying, for the most part, there's an importance there. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of represents this traditional notion of journalists that the founders of America saw. They recognized that journalists were essential to a functioning democracy and that people having free information was essential to the whole system working. And then the other thing is, a lot of people see that journalists fading in influence. So they recognize the importance, but about half of Americans say journalists are losing influence in society right now.
We spoke to one of these news influencers who you heard from earlier. Moshe Wanunu prefers being known as more of a digital journalist or news concierge. Before creating his digital platform, he was an award-winning producer leading teams at Fox News, Bloomberg TV, CNBC, and CBS News, where he was the youngest ever executive producer of the CBS Evening News.
I spent a number of years in traditional media. I was at Fox News, at sort of peak cable news. Interestingly, found myself at Bloomberg during the height of the financial crisis in 08, 09, and then went to network news at CBS in 2011, sort of the last moment when you could still grow an audience in network news in the early 2010 through 2014, before social media really took off as a news source and you started seeing people go to alternative platforms. And so I spent time there up until just before COVID and knew I needed a break from news. And then just several months into my break, figuring out what I was going to do next, the pandemic hits. We're all quarantined for a bit. And I did what I knew best, which was inform my friends and family about what was going on. Now, I didn't have the platform of a network. I had my social media outlet. And at the time, it was Instagram, a couple hundred friends and family. And I thought what I was doing was a temporary exercise. I watch Fauci, so you don't have to. I'm trying to reassure folks with, my understanding of sources that I trust amid a whole bunch of rumors, as we all remember. And so initially, it wasn't meant to be Mo News. It was meant to be Moshe's keeping busy during the height of COVID. And then we'll go back to legacy media. Then over the course of 2020, it really reinforced to me, like, wow, people are leaving these traditional platforms. They have lost trust. A certain part of the population has lost trust, as you guys have been realizing in your research. And so my several hundred friends and family turned into several thousand, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. And I'm like, oh, wait, we might be onto something here. And so over the course of the past couple of years, we have created a 24/7 Instagram news platform that I tell the audience will be verified information, reliable information, delivered to you in a nonpartisan way amid a lot of partisanship, both in traditional and new media. And then we launched a daily news podcast, the Mo News Podcast, as well as a daily afternoon newsletter.
Journalism has a way of assuming a lot of knowledge among the audience when they write a story. And that for some people, picking up a certain story and reading it is almost like coming in the middle of the movie.
It's one of the things that most frustrated me in traditional media.
Me too. We're in agreement here. I'm so glad.
Yeah, I mean, I know you're a longtime reporter as well. Like, I oversaw, you mentioned earlier, the CBS Evening News, right? Half an hour broadcast. Once you take the commercials out, you're in 9 minutes. Once you take out the sort of like teases to the upcoming segments and the headlines, you're like 19 minutes. What does that mean? I can do, at that time, I did 7 to 10 stories. 7 to 10 stories in the world, trying to present to America what's happening. And each of those stories, minute 30. If I'm being generous to the reporter, I'll give you a minute 45 or 2 minutes. Oh my goodness. And these are incredibly complex stories. And so one of the things that I like about social media is like, okay, let's back up. That requires time and context, and it is filled with interesting details.
You are sometimes labeled a news influencer, but I've heard you say you don't really like that phrase. So what is it, though, about you and that label that allows people to maybe trust you?
I think it's a phenomenon that is bigger than news itself, right? And I didn't really have a full grasp of while I was still at CBS was that people had started to lose trust. But I don't think that I really understood it until I started to hear from people directly. I think one of the reasons people come to trust me is they can have a direct relationship with me. That's something that, at CBS, we'd have millions of people watching every night, but I had no relationship with the audience. I might get ratings data without having a full conversation with the audience. So one of the things we like to do at Mo News on Instagram is I'm engaged with people, with the audience. What are you guys interested in? What do you want to know more about? How do you think we did in covering this story? Do you think we missed something? So I think there's a transparency that I try to bring. There's a correspondence that I try to bring. At times I like to joke that, my audience is my assignment editor as we decide what's happening in the news. There are things natural we're going to cover, but there are things that I was like, wow, I woke up this morning and I have 7 messages about a story I don't know much about. Clearly something is bubbling up out there. So I think that also reinforces trust. They're like, oh, I have a news outlet that listens to me. And I think one other aspect I try to bring to it is that having spent many years in traditional news, I try to break down that wall for folks, try to explain what's going on. It's a lot of things that I think as journalists we take for granted that the audience genuinely doesn't know about.
Audiences are turning to individuals like you to guide them through the news as opposed to reading the front page. You use the word news concierge. Describe what it is you're doing. Are you still a journalist? Are we entering a world where our audiences need a concierge to guide them through the news?
There's a lot out there, right? I'm old enough as a millennial even to have grown up in an era where like I woke up to a copy of the print Chicago Tribune at the end of my driveway growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, right? And that's where I got my news in the morning. So when I talk about news concierge, a bit of it is aggregation. Like, is that a source I can rely on? Does that source have an agenda? Most people don't have time, and trying to discern bias takes a lot of homework these days. And frankly, people are busy. So I still consider myself a journalist. I do original reporting. I think what we're doing is a combination of things, which is we're aggregating the headlines out there, trying to find the reliable information, confirming that information with people, and, on a day-to-day basis, original stuff.
We'll hear more from Moshe in a moment, but let's go back to Mike to hear about how Americans' news consumption habits have changed. Some of the research that your team has been working on has also just been simply in how people actually get the news, right? I mean, we have gone in several decades from, the newspaper landing in someone's front step to everyone looking at their phones.
One of the huge things we find is that older Americans are more likely to say that they intentionally seek out news. So they're going to either turn on the TV, they're going to pick up that newspaper.
It's 6:30, it's time to turn on the news.
They have their news sources that they go to and that they trust. Younger people much more likely to say, no, the news just finds me. I get news because I happen to hear it. I happen to see it, rather than actually seeking it out. So I think that's exactly what you described. I mean, it's mostly digital, whether it's your phone, your tablet, whatever. It can come through social media. There's podcasts and push notifications. That's another one, right?
Oh, right.
Newsletters is another one that we're really interested in.
And that could come from a traditional news organization, but it also could come from an influencer who says, in addition to all of my social media postings, once a week you're going to get a newsletter from me.
Exactly, yeah. And the lack of intentionality is a different experience. You're just kind of standing in a river and there's a lot of information flowing at you, and it's a little bit overwhelming.
It's been fascinating to see societal changes happening about political ideologies laid in parallel to these dramatic technological and economic changes in the news industry.
100%. We've asked before, and we asked again this year, do you think that Republicans and Democrats mostly just disagree about the issues, or do they not even agree about the facts? And the vast majority of Americans now, including Republicans and Democrats, agree that they do not agree about the facts, right? They are just living in different factual universes because of this fracturing of the ecosystem, is that, they're not getting information from the same sources. And are they just interpreting information differently, or are they actually hearing different storylines? And people agree that it's both. We asked this question during the election last year. How difficult is it to determine what's true and what's not? And more than half the people say that it's difficult. Not only is this person who's telling it to me trustworthy, but is the information actually real? So it's hard to be a news consumer these days. It's not an easy task.
News influencers have become part of this growing information ecosystem. Mike told us about Pew Research Center's recent findings about these accounts.
We defined a news influencer as someone with a large following on social media who regularly discusses news and current events. Okay. So it doesn't mean every single post has to be about news and current events, but they have to be talking about it on a regular basis. We actually looked at the social media sites themselves and did an analysis of who these news influencers are. A lot of these people are overwhelmingly male. About half of these news influencers that we identified explicitly advertise their political beliefs. And the biggest thing is the vast majority of them have no connection to a news organization. It was, about 3/4 have never been in the news industry at all in any way. And a lot of people are interested in this number. 21% of U.S. adults say that they regularly get news from news influencers. That is, people who have a lot of followers on social media and are regularly discussing news or current events. And related to that, another area that's gotten a lot of interest in recent years is TikTok. 17% of U.S. adults in our latest data say that they regularly get news on TikTok. That number is much higher among adults under 30.
When it comes to who delivers the news, what are people looking for in that person?
We asked about traits, and there were 3 that sort of rose to the top, and those were honesty, intelligence, and then the third one is really interesting. It's authenticity. People want someone who they can trust, can connect with, who feels like they're being real with me. Relatability is another thing people are, looking for in journalists. This is a really interesting tension that we've seen in some of our recent work, is people say they want no opinion in the news. They want the straight facts, right? But then you see their actual habits, and some of the judgments that they're making on this stuff could be that person's views align with theirs, and they felt seen a little bit by that.
News influencers and digital journalists like Moshe bring these elements of relatability and authenticity when interacting with their audiences. But Moshe told us how important it is to him to be nonpartisan and fact-based.
By the way, Dan, I'll tell you, the algorithm on the social media platforms rewards a partisan bent.
You bet. And it rewards outrage, right? But is there a glimmer of hope that somebody like you, who is trying to play it down the middle, can be as successful as you've been?
I am a consummate optimist. And so I would like to think, yes, I think there's an audience out there that is seeking reliable information. I think we also live in an era where ultimately a lot of people are more comfortable living in their bubble and don't want information that potentially counteracts their argument. So I will find on a nearly daily basis, oh, I thought you were objective, and then you did that. I was like, well, objectivity, like nonpartisanship doesn't mean that like your side wins all the time. Like your side, like that you advocate for, might be wrong about something or might look bad in a situation. That doesn't make, the media outlet reporting on it biased. It means that like you might have some wins and you might have some losses. And so I think, getting to your overall question, I think there is genuine hope.
Have you seen places where people can find some common ground?
One of the reasons I keep doing this is because I hear from people in my audience being like, my husband's, only voted Republican his whole life. I'm a Democrat, but like one of the only news sources we can both agree on is your source. So I think that that's the highest compliment. And we've got notes being like, you helped save my marriage. I'm like, oh my God, like I didn't get into this business trying to do that, but I'm glad because, we live in an era which makes it very hard to come to any sort of discussion. We can't even agree on which way is up and which way is down.
You've worked with middle school and high schoolers, teaching them about media literacy. How do they learn to be discerning citizens and consumers of news?
I think people have realized now that just like PE and health class are requirements, we live in an era where media literacy needs to be a requirement to be a good citizen, to be able to discern facts from falsehoods, to be a critical thinker. So, one of the things I focus on with students, and frankly, this could apply to all age groups, which is like, consider the source. Could they have an agenda? Do you feel like you're hearing multiple sides to a story? Before you reshare, have you looked at the source? And so I tell them that you could be somebody who shares reliable information, or you could be somebody who shares something that becomes one of the largest pieces of misinformation and potentially could lead to harm or violence. So, it's taking some basic steps.
Well, what can the media do to address this question of trust?
As we sort of hit this era, it shouldn't be us against them in terms of new media versus old media. And I do think if you're being honest as a new media person, you need the legacy media and its infrastructure and its, covering stuff live and the fact that it has money to travel on Air Force One. I mean, I view it as a collective effort, right? It requires the effort of people in so-called new media, people in legacy media. And we need to acknowledge our own flaws. We need to be ready to try different things. How can new media borrow the infrastructure of legacy media? And how can legacy media pick up some of the trust of new media?
Thanks for listening. You can find more information on this subject by visiting pew.org/afterthefact. You can also learn more about Mo News and how to follow their reporting at mo.news. That's mo.news. For the Pew Charitable Trusts, I'm Dan LeDuc, and this is After the Fact.